Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are zeroing in on a really crucial topic. It's fundamentally shifted, hasn't it? From a side item to, well, core business strategy. Sustainable and ethical supply. We've gathered your sources, and they focus heavily on this philosophical framework, the triple bottom line, or TBL, our mission today, to quickly, extract the most important insights on environmental management, ethical behavior, and connect those key concepts like green supply and that big industrial shift towards cradle-to-cradle operations.
Yeah, and what's fascinating looking at the sources is how sustainability isn't just a cost anymore or a box-ticking thing for compliance.
Right.
It's increasingly seen by customers, by investors, by whole communities, really as a genuine value feature.
Yeah.
So to navigate this, we really need to grasp the philosophies underneath the corporate social responsibility, or CSR, that drives it and the practical tools you actually use to measure success.
That CSR foundation feels absolutely key. It's the whole ideology, the philosophy of organizations saying, okay, we take responsibility for our actions. And in supply management, that commitment, it seems, is basically encapsulated by sustainable supply. It demands focus on both the environment and ethical behavior, everywhere in the chain.
Okay, let's try and unpack the pressure then. Why is sustainable supply such a massive challenge right now, especially when you factor in these incredibly complex global supply chains?
Well, the pressures are coming from multiple directions, and they're relentless. First, you've got wider stakeholders pressure from customers, definitely, but also investors demanding ESG reporting, environmental, social governance, and the communities where operations happen. Second, there's legislation that's constantly ramping up social and environmental legal requirements, and it varies all over the world. Then you've got pressure from inside the organization itself, the internal ethos, the company values, but maybe the most sort of urgent driver, pure risk reduction.
Companies are desperately trying to minimize reputational damage. History shows why, doesn't it? Think about the severe brand damage when child labor was found in the supply chains of huge brands, Nike, Body Shop. Those examples really stick. It shows this is about survival.
So when you mention internal ethos, is that just coming top down, from executive mission statements? Or is it also bubbling up from, say, younger employees pushing for greener, more ethical ways of working inside their own companies?
I think it's increasingly both. Compliance, sure, that's just table stakes now. But that internal pressure, that really defines the level of commitment. It forces companies to look hard at their values, look beyond just the next transaction, and manage that global long-term risk.
All right.
Which brings us to the obvious question. If risk is the driver, how do you actually measure if you're succeeding? What's the framework?
Exactly. Moving from those pressures and managing risk to the actual framework for measuring success. Our sources really zero in on one central model, the triple bottom line, TBL, sometimes called 3BL. Where did this idea even come from?
Okay, so TBL. It was coined by John Elkington, an organizational thinker, back in 1994. He really pushed the concept hard in his 1997 book, which had a wonderfully provocative title. Cannibals with Forks.
Oh.
The triple bottom line of 21st century business.
Cannibals with forks. Okay, that certainly gets your attention.
It was meant to. His whole purpose was pretty revolutionary for the time. He was demanding this extended spectrum of values, new criteria for measuring success that went way beyond just the financial profit line.
Right, the traditional bottom line.
Exactly. The TBL forces companies to account for success across three pillars: societal, ecological, and economic, which we now pretty much universally know by those catchier modern names: people, planet, profit.
People, planet, profit. Okay, let's break those three Ps down then, specifically thinking about global supply operations. What does success actually look like for each one?
Okay, so people. Success there means fair, beneficial business practices. It's the social dimension, things like free and fair trade, building proper partnerships with local stakeholders, engaging proactively with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. It's really about building social capital.
Got it. And planet.
For planet, the focus is on managing natural capital. This ties directly into those green supply concepts like cradle-to-cradle operations, both in manufacturing and logistics. We'll dig into that C2C idea more, I think.
Yes, May. And the last one.
And finally, profit. That's the traditional piece, of course. Financial viability, economic benefits. Can't forget that. But if you connect it to the big picture, TBL provides the structure. It's the language, really, for companies to assess their long-term success, recognizing that all three are interdependent. You can't just, sacrifice one P for the other two and expect genuine sustainability.
That interdependence feels critical. Okay, so if the planet pillar demands this shift in thinking, how do these TBL concepts actually show up in operations? We need to talk about moving away from that old linear way of thinking, the take, make, dump model, right?
That linear model, yeah, that's what we often call cradle to grave, C2G.
Yeah.
It's the traditional economy. You extract resources, make something, use it, and then disposal is the end of the line,
Landfill, mostly.
usually. The alternative, and really the direction things are moving, is cradle to cradle,
Hmm.
ADC. That defines the circular economy. C2C relies on concepts like regenerative design, designing things to last or be reused, designing products specifically for easy disassembly, and having strong reverse logistics systems to get materials back and reuse them.
Okay.
Now, it's probably worth mentioning quickly, lean principles, often known by the Japanese term muda, which just means waste reduction, those are often promoted as a form of sustainability, and they are. But they aren't always fully baked into a true C2C design philosophy from the start.
Right, reducing waste is good, but C2C sounds more fundamental. And that C2C model must rely heavily on understanding the true environmental footprint of a product, not just at the end, but right from the very beginning. So what exactly does a life cycle assessment and LCA analyze?
LCA is the essential tool here. It's a detailed, holistic analysis that looks at all the environmental aspects, all the potential impacts linked to a product or a process, even a service, across its entire life, from digging raw materials out of the ground right through to disposal or ideally reuse or recycling.
Okay, so it's comprehensive.
Vary. And the
Yeah.
impact categories it covers are broad.
Yeah.
We're not just talking CO2, though that's in there. It measures everything from global warming potential and acidification to
Mhm.
smog creation, ozone layer depletion, resource consumption.
Mhm.
But here's the critical detail, the really mind-blowing stat from your sources.
Yeah.
The emphasis in LCA is heavily, heavily weighted toward the product design phase.
Well,
Why? Because a staggering 80% of the environmental burden of a product is fixed right there
yeah.
at the beginning, in the design.
80%. Wow. Fixed at the design stage. That just completely shifts the conversation, doesn't it? All the costs, the resources, it puts it right upstream. Makes R&D and design teams the primary drivers of sustainability.
Absolutely. They hold the keys in many ways.
So if design locks in 80% of the environmental burden, what's the actual mechanism that closes the loop, on the back end to achieve that C2C goal?
That mechanism is reverse logistics. It's basically the organized distribution of used materials backwards through the supply chain for recycling, remanufacture, reuse.
Okay.
The mobile phone take-back system is a fantastic real-world example. You collect old phones, right? That feeds back into demand. How?
Mm-hmm.
Through reusing components, refurbishing whole phones, and sophisticated recycling of the valuable metals inside, it connects the collection point directly back to the component market. It closes the loop.
That makes sense. Okay, now let's shift gears slightly. From planet to people, the ethical side. This ethical imperative seems to deal with some of the toughest challenges, doesn't it? Especially with outsourcing growing so rapidly worldwide. What ethical problems are really bubbling up because of this relentless search for lower-cost labor?
Well, the core issue is quite stark, really. Outsourcing often pushes production into regions where, frankly, labor laws might be barely existent. Or if they exist, they're rarely enforced properly.
Right, turning cost savings into huge potential liabilities.
Exactly. And this leads to genuinely horrific consequences that, often make headlines. We've seen specific devastating examples, factory fires in places like Bangladesh, constant recalls of big brand products found to contain harmful substances. It just destroys consumer trust globally.
That's a massive risk. So given that inherent danger, what does an ethical supply chain actually demand from companies today? Why can't they just, trust the contracts they sign with suppliers?
It demands a much more structured approach. Your sources talk about something like an ethical supply mind map. It has to start with a really thorough investigation, a kind of, a diagnosis of all their outsourcing activities. You simply can't rely only on a contract anymore because the global production landscape changes so fast.
Okay, so diagnosis is key.
It is, because that diagnosis has to recognize that the very desire to save costs by outsourcing to low-wage countries is precisely what introduces this systemic risk around labor conditions and safety. You need constant vigilance, due diligence, auditing, real transparency to prove you're committed. Because ignoring that diagnosis, it leads straight back to that immediate risk of brand damage, liability, and the ever-present threat of recalls we see increasing today.
So, wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've covered a lot of ground: CSR, the triple bottom line, that C2C circular model versus C2G, life cycle assessment, reverse logistics, and the ethical need for diagnosis. Plus, the big drivers behind it all, like managing brand risk and cutting environmental impact.
I think the core challenge really boils down to this. Sustainable and ethical supply is about juggling those societal, ecological, and economic concerns all at the same time. People, planet, profit. They aren't optional extras anymore. They are completely interdependent if an organization wants any kind of long-term success.
And for you listening, perhaps the single most powerful number to take away is that 80% figure. The fact
Yeah.
that 80% of a product's environmental footprint is locked in right at the initial design stage, that completely shifts the focus, the need for investment way upstream. It demands immediate action from R&D and design teams.
Which brings us to a final, maybe provocative thought for you to mull over. Given that sustainability is now seen as this critical value feature by customers, how does that fundamental difference between cradle to grave, the old linear economy, and cradle to cradle, the circular one, how does that impact the initial investment decisions a company has to make?
Long before a product ever hits the shelf or faces disposal, it really raises a big question about true commitment, doesn't it? The willingness to actually invest upfront in regenerative design, in robust reverse logistics, versus just doing the bare minimum for compliance in the cheapest way possible. Where does the company really stand?